It's 4:30 in the morning. The house is silent. I am sitting in front of a camera that costs less than most people's phone. In a country where the system was never really designed for people like us to win. No inherited wealth. No powerful connections, no safety net, just an idea, a small room, and the decision to start anyway. And I want to tell you about a country that started with less than that, much less. In 1965, Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, not left, not choose independence, expelled, kicked out like an unwanted tenant. It had no army, no natural resource, no fresh water. It had to import drinking water from the same country that just rejected it. The land was just 733 square kilometers, smaller than Delhi, surrounded by large, suspicious neighbors who expected it to fail. On the day of independence, its prime minister stood in front of cameras and wept publicly on national television, not from joy, from the weight of inheriting a crisis nobody wanted. That country now is one of the richest on earth. GDP per capita higher than United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan. Achieved in a single generation from a starting point of absolute nothing. Here is why this matters to you specifically. You have been told, directly or indirectly, that your circumstances are the reason that you can't build something extraordinary. Wrong city, wrong connections, wrong resources, wrong timing. Not enough for the right things. Too much of the wrong ones. Singapore is the most complete demolition of that excuse that history has ever produced. And today we are going to study exactly how they did it. Most people think Singapore got lucky. Strategic location, right timing, American backing during the Cold War. This is the comfortable explanation because it means the miracle was unrepeatable and the lessons does not apply to you. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Singapore did not get lucky. Singapore got ruthless. Ruthless about what actually works. Ruthless about making hard decisions fast and executing them without apology. Ruthless about turning the absence of every advantage into the hunger that built every advantage from scratch. I have spent weeks inside this story, reading Lee Kuan Yew's own memoirs, economic analysis, political histories, and the specific decision that turned a third world swamp into a first world miracle. I am going to show you exactly what they did, what it cost, and what it is actually telling you about your own situation. Here is how we move through it. First, the day Singapore was born and why everyone expected it to die. Then the man who decided it would not. Then the three specific decisions that build everything. Then what Singapore traded to get here because there was a price and pretending otherwise is dishonest. Then the numbers that should not be possible. And finally, what Singapore is actually telling you, because this video is not about a city or a state. It is about the decision to be ruthless about what you have instead of defected by what you do not. Singapore started with a crisis, a tiny island, no water, no allies, and a prime minister crying on television. It decided none of those things were the reasons to fail. The question this video ends with is whether you are making the same decision about your own life right now. Subscribe before we go further. This channel exists to show you what is possible when people refuse to accept the story the world writes for them. Now let's get into it. Singapore did not choose independence. Independence was forced on it. On August 9, 1965, Malaysia expelled Singapore from the Federation. The decision was made in Kuala Lumpur by politicians who saw Singapore's Chinese majority population as a political threat. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's Prime Minister, found out through a phone call. He has 24 hours to tell his people they were now alone. He went on television that evening, Cambridge educated, brilliant, composed in every public appearance before and after this moment, and he broke down. Tears on national television, not performed grief, real grief, because he understood what most people in that room yet did not fully grasp. Singapore had nothing. No army to defend itself, no water supply of its own. It imported water through a pipeline from Malaysia, the country that just expelled it. No oil, no gas, no minerals, No agricultural land worth mentioning. 733 square kilometers of tropical island. With a population of under 2 million people, surrounded by Indonesia to the south and Myanmar to the north. Both large, both suspicious, both expecting Singapore to come back crawling within a decade. Every analyst, every economist, every neighboring government, same verdict. This country will not survive. That was the starting point, not a foundation, a hole. And the question of what Singapore did next is one of the most instructive story in the history of human ambition. Lee Kuan Yew was not a typical politician. He was not interested in being liked. He was interested in results. He understood something that most leaders never accept, that sentiment without strategy is suicide. You can't feed people with speeches. You can't build an economy on national pride. You need decisions, hard ones, fast ones, ones that will make people angry in the short term and grateful in the long term. He looked at Singapore's map and found the one thing nobody could take away. Location. Singapore sat at the intersection of busiest shipping lanes in the world, the Strait of Malacca, connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Every ship moving between Europe, the Middle East and East Asia passed through or near Singapore. The geography was not a resource, but it was a platform. He built everything on that platform. He told his people the truth immediately. No softening, no false comfort. We have nothing. We must become indispensable to everyone. Every country that wanted to do business in Asia will need to come through us. We will be so useful, so efficient, so corruption free, so strategically valuable, so no one will able to afford to let us fail. Then he spent the next 3 decades making that true. He was frequently authoritarian. He suppressed political opposition. He controlled the press. He sued critics into bankruptcy. He is one of the most controversial leaders of 20th century and also one of the most effective. Both things are true simultaneously. And the uncomfortable question his story forces you to ask is not whether you approve his methods, it is whether you have been half as ruthless about what you actually want. Singapore's transformation was not accidental. And it was not gradual. It was the result of 3 specific decisions made early that compounded over decades into the country you see today. Decision 1. English became the official language of government and business. Not Mandarin, not Malaya, not Tamil. English. In the multi-ethnic society where English was the language of the colonial power that had just left, this was deeply controversial. It felt like a betrayal of cultural identity of many Singaporeans. Lee Kuan Yew made it anyway. The result, Singapore could speak directly to every multinational corporation, every global bank, every international institution on earth from day one. While neighboring countries spent decades translating and adapting, Singapore was already fluent in the language of global capital. One decision compounded over 60 years. Today, Singapore is the home to the regional headquarters of more Fortune 500 companies than almost any city on earth. Decision 2. Zero tolerance on corruption with absolute no exceptions. Singapore's founding generation understood something most governments pretend not to. Corruption is not a cultural inevitability. It is a political choice. They paid government ministers almost the highest salaries in the world. A cabinet minister in Singapore earns more than the president of the United States. The logic was precise. If you pay people poorly and surrounds them with an opportunity for corruption, some of them will take it. If you pay people exceptionally and prosecute corruption without any mercy, almost none of them will. Corruption is expensive. Integrity is an investment. Today, Singapore ranks as one of the least corrupted countries on earth. That reputation alone is worth billions in foreign investments annually. Decision 3. Education as pure economic strategy. Not education for cultural enrichment. Not education as a social good. Education as the deliberate production of human capital that the global economy needed. Engineering, finance, science, medical. The government studies what skills multinational companies were paying premium for and produce those skills at a scale. It is then made Singapore the easiest place in the world for those companies to hire those people. The result, within 2 decades, Singapore has transformed from a country with no resources into a country whose primary resource was the quality of its human capital. The resource cannot be imported, cannot be stolen, and compounds with every generation. 3 decisions, all controversial, all executed, without any apology, all correct. This is the part of Singapore's story that the motivational version always leaves out. Every miracle has a price. Singapore's prize was freedom. Singapore is not a democracy in a way most people understand the world. The People's Action Party has won every election since independence in 1965. Opposition politicians have been sued into bankruptcy. Journalists who criticize government has faced legal consequences. Chewing gums was literally illegal for over a decade. The government controls where people live through housing allocation policies designed to enforce ethnic diversity quotas. Singapore traded political freedom for economic freedom. Its citizens can't always say what they want to, but they can build businesses, accumulate wealth, travel freely, access world-class healthcare, and live in one of the most safest, cleanest, most efficient cities on earth. The streets work, the trains run on time, the government does what it says it will do. Whether that trade is worth it is a question every Singaporeans answer privately. But the trade exists. Success always has a price. The only question is whether you know what you are paying before you pay it. Let the data speak, because the numbers of what Singapore achieved are genuinely difficult to believe. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was approximately $500. Today, it exceeds $65,000. Higher than United States, higher than Germany, higher than Japan in one generation. Singapore has the world's busiest port by cargo tonnage. Changi Airport has been voted the world's best for 8 consecutive years. Its education system rank first or second globally in maths and science. Consistently, not occasionally. Zero oil, zero gas, zero significant minerals. The entire country is smaller than London. $500 to $65,000. Third world to first world. One generation, no resources. Those numbers are not inspiration. They are a demolition. A complete, documented, historically verified demolition of the excuse that circumstances determine the outcomes. The numbers do not lie. Excuses do. Singapore is not a model to copy. It is a mirror to look into. You will never replicate Singapore's specific decisions in your own life. You are not running a city or a state. You do not have Lee Kuan Yew's specific combinations of intellect, ruthlessness, and historical timing. The 3 decisions that built Singapore: English as a business language, zero corruption, education as economic strategy, are not transferable as policies. But the principles underneath them is. Singapore is telling you that circumstances are not destiny, that the absence of resources forces the invention of strategy, that the countries and people who succeeded are rarely the ones who had the most advantages. They are the ones who were most ruthless about using whatever they had, who looked at what they possessed, however small, however insufficient it seemed, and decided to become indispensable to the world using exactly that. Lee Kuan Yew looked at a tiny island with no water and found one thing nobody could take away: location. One asset, built everything on it, refused to wait for more. What is your one asset? What is the thing you have right now, however small it seems, that you could build everything on if you stopped waiting for the conditions to improve and started executing with what exists today? Singapore started with a crisis: a tiny island, no water, no allies, and a prime minister crying on television. It decided that none of those things were the reasons to fail. That decision made once, executed relentlessly, never walked back in the entire story. The question it leaves you with is not whether you has what Singapore had. You do not. Nobody does. The question is whether you are making the Singapore decision about your own life, whether you are being as ruthless about what you have as Singapore was about what it had. Because if you are not, Singapore's story is not inspiration. It is a verdict. So here is where this leaves you. You come into this video knowing Singapore was successful. What you did not know is how it started. Expelled, rejected, no water, no army, no allies, a prime minister crying on television because nobody wants them, and they build the most efficient society on earth anyway. Not because they got lucky, not because the circumstances were favorable, because they made a decision. One decision made once, executed relentlessly, never walked back. The decision was simple. We have no right to be poor and no excuse to stay that way. That is it. That is the entire Singapore miracle compressed into one sentence. Not a policy, not a resource, not a geographic advantage, a decision about what they refused to accept. Now here is the part that is uncomfortable. You already know what your Singapore decision is. You know exactly what you have been waiting to start, what you have been calling not ready, what you have been calling not the right time, what you have been protecting behind the excuse of wrong circumstances, wrong resources, wrong city, wrong connections. Singapore had worse circumstances than you, worse resources, a worse starting point than almost any country in history, and it decided none of those things were the point. The point was what they did with what they had. You are sitting somewhere, maybe early morning, maybe late at night, with more than Singapore had in 1965. More access, more information, more tool, more opportunity to build something that reaches beyond the room you are sitting in. The question is not whether your circumstances are hard. They are. The question is whether you are being as ruthless about what you have as Singapore was about what it had. Because if you are not, Singapore's story is not inspiration. It's a verdict. This channel exists for exactly this, to take the stories history forgot to teach you and turn them into the clarity you need right now. Subscribe because next week we go even deeper, and because more clearly you see what is actually possible, the harder it becomes to accept anything less. Singapore decided it had no right to be poor. What have you decided?